What's up, Nostalgia Trappers? David Parsons here. Welcome to the program. We got a lot going on this week, so let's get started. I don't know about you, but do you feel like we're living in a quote-unquote fraying social fabric? I bring it up because I was reading an article a few weeks ago, I think it's in the New York Times, about rising pedestrian deaths in America. It was super fucking disturbing because pedestrians are just getting slaughtered all over the place in the United States. And the article was sort of searching for ideas about why. The most obvious one was the fact that Americans drive gigantic SUVs and trucks that have zero fucking visibility. And so they literally can't see people. I mean, most of the people that are getting hit by these cars across America in numbers that are literally exploding right now, like unprecedented, are being run over and hit in the crosswalks. They're like legally crossing the street, and people are just not seeing them while they plow right through these fucking intersections. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is that during COVID in particular, in the last 2 years, the hit and run aspect of these accidents has increased exponentially as well, meaning people aren't even fucking stopping after they slaughter pedestrians on the street. And that's something that's been happening in my county too. I don't know about you, but there have been a number of like really high profile, awful cases of kids and elderly people and adults, workers biking to work, etc., just getting killed by people in their cars that don't even stop. There's a lot of reasons behind this beyond the SUV thing and the visibility thing. People are distracted, scrolling through social media and texting on their phones, etc. They're drunk, they're high, they're tired, they're angry. And the Times, I think it was the Times, put all of that in a box called the fraying social fabric. And that the phrase has sort of been turning around in my head in the weeks since reading that article because it makes sense to me, and I wonder if it resonates with you, just in terms of the kind of callous attitude toward other human beings in the United States that's I've honestly felt my entire life. I mean, I come from the suburbs, so you can feel that everywhere. But there's something, I don't know, it seems worse lately. I wanted to talk about that sort of thing. It's hard to talk about, like, I don't know, social fabrics and things like that. But my guest today has done a lot of thinking about the subject. His name is Adam Kotsko. He is currently an assistant professor of humanities at North Central College in Chicago. He's written a number of really cool books about a lot of subjects, including, he's written about Zizek. He's written about books about philosophy and religion. But there are two books that stuck out to me because they were about pop culture that I wanted to specifically talk with Adam about today. And those books are called Awkwardness from 2010 and Why We Love Sociopaths from 2012, both of which are taking on that sort of moment in early 21st century television in which there were lots of sociopathic characters in prestige TV like Mad Men and Sopranos and Breaking Bad. At the same time, there was sort of like this cringe comedy thing happening on shows like The Office and Curb Your Enthusiasm. Adam has a lot to tell us about what those shows might have to key into for us when thinking about neoliberalism, capitalism, and the historical moment we all inhabit. We've done shows on The Office before. In fact, I think I'll link that episode with Justin Rogers Cooper in which we talked about The Office and neoliberalism. For me, it's actually particularly the American Office and its deep popularity among millennials is a really, really important thing. And this idea of like being awkward around one another, there's a lot to say about that, and there's a lot to say about in terms of the sort of long arc of social reality in America, and particularly what's happened since the 1960s. So this was a really honestly illuminating conversation for me. I hope you enjoy it. There's lots more Nostalgia Trap content out there if you're interested. We've been doing live streams. We're going to bring those back with Justin Rogers Cooper, where we talk about the news, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what is happening with that, how it's stirring things up, particularly in domestic politics, and that angle is something we've been talking about a lot. So if you want to check all that out, you can do it at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We really appreciate the support. We are independent media, and we want to keep it on. So if you can support the show, that really helps us. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks so much, and enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Adam Kotsko. All right. Well, Adam Kotsko, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it. How are you?
Doing great. How about you?
Pretty good. I've been enjoying your roasting of Bono over the last day on the poem. Or is a limerick a poem? That's a question I have. That's maybe for the literary critics, but Bono, we've been talking a lot about cringe and cringe music on this show lately, and it feels like Bono falls into that category. I don't know, that like the Doors fall into. Do you put him in there? Like that kind of like you're not supposed to like this stuff anymore? It's not cool.
Oh, well, yeah, it's definitely not cool. I think, yeah, and his persona has become very cringe. All of his kind of self-aggrandizing charitable works and like opinionating on everything. And I will say a limerick is technically a poem.
Okay, good.
It's just a very low-class kind of poem.
It's funny. I think a lot of people first read it and didn't understand that it was a limerick. Like seeing the initial social media reaction to the poem was like, oh, look how terrible this is. And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, it's written like a fucking limerick. Like it's supposed to be that way.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that he wrote that down and decided I really need to share this with people.
Your work, I thank you for coming on the show because your work caught my attention a few weeks ago, and it's funny when I emailed you, you said, why is this popping up? Because some of the work that I was responding to is work from a couple years ago or several years ago, but work that touches on, I don't know, I think important topics that I think people are talking about today, which is awkwardness, creepiness, the sort of like big trends in American comedy in particular, but also your take on sociopaths and drama, like, characters like Walter White and Tony Soprano and Don Draper. Was that stuff you were developing in graduate school when you were, how were you thinking about like conceiving of pop culture as a text that was going to be a text for you to reach the public that way?
Yeah, it was more of a side project, when I was in grad school and, especially when I was doing exams and working on my dissertation, it's a very lonely time. And at that time, I would get like all the Netflix DVDs, and it was the golden age of television. Like the three shows you just mentioned, and I just devoured all of that stuff. And like many people who got their PhD during the Great Financial Crisis, I wondered if I might need to transition to another line of work. And trying to write about pop culture seemed like one possible path. And it was kind of in a spirit of experimentation and also of kind of like retconning all of my compulsive TV watching into like research.
I love it. I'm glad you said that, because I was always trying to find a way to loop in the stuff that I'm watching and obsessing over as a kind of pop culture consumer into my academic work. But it seems like there's a lot of connection there. It's not necessarily a cheat. It seems like for me, like, I don't know, pretty critical to understand shows like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that actually the book that seemed to make the biggest impact at the time was Sociopaths. And that really was at the time when anti-hero type of drama was absolutely inescapable. Like that was, out of the three books, that's the one where I really hit it at just the right time, so that it was like really clear in everybody's minds of, yeah, wow, it's weird that every single show I'm watching is starring a complex, semi-evil guy who we're still supposed to sympathize with.
What was that era about? And is it over? I mean, it feels like you're right. I mean, it was hard not to notice that there were all these sort of shows about kind of like complex psychological portraits of evil white males, I guess. I don't know if that's still going on. It seems like that was really like the prestige TV moment What I know you do a lot more than you do. Reading your work, you do a lot more than sort of like this captured the zeitgeist of the moment. You're saying something a lot deeper than that. But I'm wondering what we can do with the sociopath, because it's kind of interesting that like, I don't know, the lead up to the Trump moment is that obsession.
Yeah, yeah. I think that you have to contextualize it partly in the post 9/11 like war on terror mold, um, where in so many ways like we were the bad guys, like committing aggressive wars, like setting up torture camps, all this kind of stuff. And like one of my main examples in Sociopaths 24, it was showing torture sympathetically in primetime TV every week. Like that's a sick society.
Yeah,
And
I
yet
remember
somehow
that.
like,
Jesus.
yeah, I remember one time, this is in like, let's say 2011 or something like that. I was watching a show and there was a torture scene going on. And I thought, just a minute, this is the bad guy. And this is something I'm not supposed to like. That was the first time I had seen torture be bad and be a signal of this is the bad guy
Yeah.
for like a decade. And so I think that this kind of cultural milieu of like we're doing really evil things, but it's necessary. Like I think that produced a need for content that could help people kind of navigate this cognitive dissonance, and feel sophisticated for it. And
Yeah,
a
because
lot of
these
those
shows
have
are,
that in it.
yeah, these shows were pitched to a particular sort of like New Yorker audience. It seems like, you know what I mean. Like these weren't shows. I mean, I know Sopranos has a pretty wide cultural impact, and so does Mad Men, etc. But they do seem like, they're prestige shows for a reason. They're like talking. They seem like they're talking to like a certain like middle class liberal sort of audience, and that's what makes it extra disturbing to me, honestly, because there's sort of like this hand wringing about like, well, let's look at characters and sort of understand the position they're in while they're, achieving and committing all these evil acts.
Yeah. And I think that does appeal to a certain liberal outlook that like the more you can sympathize with somebody whose views are different from you, like the more virtuous it is. Um, and why not be like, I can sympathize with the murderous philanderer. Like, look at how righteous I am. But like, it's kind of a weird stance towards life. But
Yeah, it is. I mean, to me, like the Walter White character was like, it sort of indicated something about, I don't know. And I think this is something you get into. Maybe we can talk a little bit about this. It's sort of like, there's a criminal element here. There's a sort of like almost like it's square to follow all the rules, and the characters who follow all the rules are the ones that lose. In other words, these shows seem to like reinforce the idea that good guys finish last, and you gotta cheat and manipulate the system. And I don't know. Do you read like a deep cynicism there? There's something really scary about it to me, especially Walter White. It seems very clear that Walter White is like he played by the rules. He got fucked over by the world and capitalism. I mean, ultimately, like it's his healthcare bills that lead him to be a criminal. And I feel like there were a lot of people who got a lot of juice from that. A lot of like feeling like, yeah, that's how it is, and that's what you got to do. And that seems like a really fucking scary statement about where we're at as an American society. If there's like a kind of baseline belief that you got to fucking cheat to get ahead.
yeah, and that's what I did tie it into the kind of like really aggressive and uncompromising form of capitalism that was just growing and accelerating at that time, and continues to this day in different forms. Neoliberalism, and like it seems as though it does reflect a kind of broken social contract, like that. Previously, you could have the fantasy, if I just work hard and play by the rules, I'm going to get ahead, and that was increasingly not the case. And it seems like for that kind of situation, that the sociopath show provides a kind of release valve or something like that. I think the identification with Walter White did really, for a lot of people, this was like a cathartic experience. But I think it brought out a lot of ugly things too, because I think these shows are kind of like they want to have their cake and eat it too. Like they want to give you the satisfaction of identifying with the sociopath, but then they also want to punish you for it.
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of things that they did to like show the audience, like, wait a minute, Walter White's not cool. He resents his, brilliant, strong, and beautiful wife, or he actually kind of hates the fact that he has a disabled son and is ashamed of him. And people would watch it and they'd be like, fuck yeah, screw you, Skylar. Like, screw you, you dumb kid. Like,
isn't that amazing? I remember now, the anti-Skylar discourse, which was like, she's just getting in the way of Walter's success. She's getting in the way of Walter's plans, as if the show was like a self-help show, like a model of like how to be is Walter White, and anyone who gets in the way of him, rather than a show that's sort of exploring, I don't know, the contours of a guy Breaking Bad. Right. I don't know. I haven't returned to Breaking Bad. I feel like in part I watched Sopranos like a million times, but Breaking Bad didn't seem like it had the same. I felt like Breaking Bad was more of like a story gimmick in some ways. You know what I mean? Like it was sort of like the mechanics of the story were what drove the interest, rather than the sort of psychological depth that you see in Sopranos or maybe even Mad Men.
Yeah, and I think that's why Better Call Saul is a more satisfying show than Breaking Bad, because the character of Jimmy, who becomes Saul Goodman, is so much more complex and ambivalent, and like you can see things going a lot of different ways. Like it's a more genuinely open story, even though paradoxically we know where he ends up, but that somehow makes us like savor these moments of like, man, he could have just been a lawyer helping elderly people with their wills if he hadn't like screwed up the situation or whatever. And we've actually rewatched the existing seasons of Better Call Saul already, even though it's not done, and it really holds up. I did rewatch it once with my partner who hadn't seen it all the way through Breaking Bad, and you're basically right. And it's so harsh and negative, like it's just not fun to rewatch.
Yeah, I think I watched it really quickly. I mean, I literally did the binge thing with it and watched probably 4 or 5 episodes in a row each day, because it's a bingey show. I feel like that show, more than a lot of others, was designed to have kind of an engine of narrative interest that left you with a cliffhanger at the end that dropped you right back into it at the beginning. And there was something really, really clever about the way that they constructed that. But yeah, at the same time, that whole opening, that sequence that's I'm remembering now, they did like a musical sequence at the beginning of one of the shows where they did like a kind of like opening of a TV sitcom about a girl that was like on meth in a hotel room. And it's just like this really, I remember watching it just being like, I know they're trying to go for some ironic kind of goofy laughs here or something, but it was just so fucking depressing watching it, honestly. Yeah, I get that from Breaking Bad for sure. What about Don Draper? Where do we put that guy? Because I feel like, of all those characters, Don Draper is the most like, professional, the guy with a job, the guy that's actually not a criminal like Walter White or Tony Soprano. But he seems like he falls into that category. I feel like an advertising agency almost feels criminal in some ways to people.
Right.
Do people want to be these characters? I think that's what I'm asking. It's like, it seems like there's a lot of these shows are about like, almost like, as much as they're about sociopaths, they're about like people we want to be.
Right. Yeah. And I think Don Draper is a great example of somebody like, I mean, you'd like to be that good looking or that charismatic that whenever you walk into the room, you're in charge or something like that.
Yeah, right.
But I think it shows that there's a kind of hollowness under that too. Like there's so many, for every scene where he's like just, seamlessly kind of lording over everybody and elegantly solving his problems, there's another one where he's just in like sheer absolute panic and has no idea what to do. And I think that it's interesting, you do get tired of Don as you go on, and like the fandom, I think, increasingly wished that the writers would have sidelined him in favor of other characters.
There were definitely more interesting characters and storylines on the show than Don, who really is kind of one note in a way that a lot of the other characters we're talking about aren't. You said Don is like a sort of like, you never see the guy smile. It's just a flat line across his mouth from almost the entirety of the show. He's like a cipher. Yeah, there's definitely more interesting characters on that show for sure.
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting structural thing with Mad Men that like, like the fact that he has stolen his identity, that he's really like a hick from the Boondocks who kind of got this head start in life through accidentally getting his commanding officers killed and then stealing his dog tags. I'm sorry,
That's
spoiler alert for those who have like haven't watched the first season, but um and like that his entire life is an advertisement and is something false. And so this gives him like special access to it. And yet he seems to believe in it too. Like there's the one part, the Kodak carousel pitch where he's like showing slides of his own family.
Mm-hmm.
And we know in real life that his family is falling apart and that he doesn't really love his wife or children and that he's just doing it because it's what you're supposed to do. And yet it seems like as he's delivering this, he believes it in all sincerity, like he believes in the American dream, even though he can't get himself to really do it or like it. And I mean, that's the level of deception and self-deception in that show. It's really remarkable. And for me, it's kind of the most artistically accomplished TV show probably ever, other than maybe Twin Peaks: The Return. Which is,
I don't even know. Honestly, Twin Peaks: The Return is so daunting. I don't even know how to approach it because it's playing on so many different registers. I'm intimidated that you even brought it up because I watched it. I've watched it twice and I'm still kind of like processing it, I guess, because part of it is, and this is why I wanted to talk to you in part, Adam, is because I don't know. It's describing like a lot of what Lynch is doing is playing with all these different affects and playing with the way that these affects sort of bounce off of expectations of what even a movie is or what even a TV show is. And that's why that the concept of awkwardness really popped out to me. I'm glad you wrote about that because I don't know. First of all, how do we define awkwardness as a sort of like cultural phenomenon? Because I think of it often like I associate it with like cringe comedy. And if we're thinking about that, I'm thinking about like Christopher Guest and like the mockumentary thing. And the sort of like, I think that's where I first noticed that there was something like that going on. And then with, I guess the first Office, the Ricky Gervais Office. But what do we do with that? Because it also seems like something that we're in like a vibe shift in 2022, of like things moving around. But we've come from, with millennial culture in particular, like the popularity of The Office, the American Office is just staggering to me. Like my students, and for years, would talk about like binge watching The Office over and over again, watching it to go to sleep. Like it's like a comforting show. It's a show that they just are obsessed with. And it was sort of really spoke to them. I'm wondering, like, what is that awkwardness that kind of structures these shows, and where does it come from? Because it seems like it is of a particular era, if that makes sense. You could like historicize this.
Yeah. I think that, kind of alongside these like great sociopath shows, there were also like a lot of these like cringe comedy shows. People have like approached me like, shouldn't you write something about cringe? And I'm like, I already did. Like awkwardness and creepiness, that's already what cringe was. But it somehow hadn't reached like a cultural critical mass yet.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, I'm trying to think through awkwardness and like just our everyday experience of like people doing awkward things, or we feel awkward that we've done something. And I hit on the definition that it's like the feeling of discomfort that accompanies the violation of social expectations, not laws, but like social expectations, and like situations where you're not sure what should I do? How should I handle this? Like, for example, this morning I was working at the coffee shop and I spilled my coffee all over myself. And I'm like, so what should I do? Should I came all the way here. I just started, I have work to do. Do I just sit here with my wet pants? That's what I ultimately chose to do, but I'm not sure that was the right thing to do. It just felt weird. I felt like the whole balance of the situation had been thrown off. And
is it partly because like the idea of people watching? I wonder, because I part of me is like the awkwardness comes around the time of like surveillance culture and the internet coming and being a part of our lives, and like everyone is watching, and there's always going to be. I mean, I even get the sense that when I do something like that, like because I'm also a guy that will definitely spill my coffee all over myself, I'm always like, there's someone that made a video of that, and it's going to go on. You know what I mean? Like, I'm always like, there's going to be a viral moment out of my embarrassing social snafu. It seems like we're kind of prepped for that.
Yeah, well, I think in the YouTube of one's own mind, those moments become kind of classic viral hits that play over and over as you're lying in bed at night or whatever. And I mean, yes, the wait staff at the cafe, they were very, helpful and trying to like make sure I was comfortable. They got me a new cup of coffee, so I can't leave. They got me a new cup of coffee, right?
Right. You just want to like run away.
And I think that might be part of it. But I think that a more profound reason that awkwardness really resonates with people is that in a lot of situations, and a growing number of social situations, there really aren't firm expectations of what you're supposed to do. Like that, our expectations are breaking down, and like some things that used to be the norm now have flipped around and become offensive. Like, for instance, for a man to hold a door for a woman. Back in the day, it was considered polite and normal. Nowadays, I would almost maybe prefer to pointedly not hold a door for a woman, to avoid sending the message that I'm a chauvinist or something like this. And like, there's a lot of stuff like that. It comes from social change, often very beneficial social change. Like the old way of doing things was obviously not good. But the benefit of it was that it was at least clear and people knew what their role was and what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to behave. And we haven't developed one, like a way of kind of regulating our behavior since then that is like convincing to most people. And one thing I explore in awkwardness is the notion of like, what if just sitting with our awkwardness could become the new norm? And I think that's what The Office really does. Like, they've all done these like viral awkward moments in front of each other. They've all done like mortifying things in front of each other, like I hate myself, I can't believe I did that. And yet they all come back to work the same day, and they're all the next day, and they're all supportive of each other and stuff like that. Like,
it's almost like the absence of shame. I wonder like where is shame fit in here? Because it seems like part of the awkwardness is like embarrassment that you've done something wrong, shame that others witnessed it. And if we could get to a place where we didn't feel awkward, it would be a place where that shame is gone. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, none of the awkwardness like produces a permanent stain, let's say.
Right.
Where, like I think of the Pam and Jim, right? I mix up the US and UK Office sometimes, but their love story, part of what makes an office romance awkward is that even leaving aside the potential like for getting fired for harassment or something like that, it's that if you reveal this, I think of you in a very different way than maybe you expected me to, and they don't reciprocate, then you have to keep seeing this person every single day still.
Right.
And it's just this constant daily humiliation of like, oh, they think I'm weird. They think I'm creepy. I can't believe I did that. And I mean, there are a ton of office crushes in that show that people just kind of grin and bear it and move on. Like they aren't all actualized, but I think that's part of what makes it. It's kind of like a Star Trek: The Next Generation, but the final frontier is awkwardness.
I wonder, I love the idea that we don't know how to be, and that, that there's this sense that no one knows the baseline consensus way to behave, especially like in a quote unquote professional environment. I think about, God, it's a really tough thing to think and talk about. But you brought it up in terms of romance, like in institutional spaces, like schools, like corporations or offices. It's what do you do with erotic energy? Because they're eroticized spaces. I feel like every human space is an eroticized space. But what do you do with that erotic energy? And it seems like modernism was so much about repression of that. Like you repress that erotic energy when you're in these institutional spaces because we are all, sort of behaving in a professional sort of way. But when that breaks down, it seems like a chaotic moment. It seems like it partly explains why we have such discomfort talking about this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that obviously the repressive model did not work functionally. It just incited even more. It kind of made transgression all the more appealing.
Right.
That's one part of Mad Men, like that they're all wearing their suits and ties, and they all seem so buttoned up, and like all the women look like they're 20 years older because they're wearing like clothes like your grandma or something like that. And then they're all just like screwing on the couch in their office too. Like behavior that would be unimaginable or like indefinitely like legally actionable in
Right.
today's world. And I think that like if you look at a situation like I think of a lot of things of 70s culture, for instance, that there was a desire to get past that repression, but without actually remedying the hierarchies and the power plays and the power dynamics that actually made that repression like kind of helpful, or at least like made people less likely to be victimized. And it
Yeah.
led to a lot of behaviors that we now see to be abusive. And like back in the 70s, for an older man to have sex with a 17-year-old, like, oh, that's liberated, you're not being repressed or something. And nowadays, like, no, that's actually statutory rape. Like, that's not cool. That's not liberated. That's just abuse. And I think that, at least in our culture now, I think we've gotten past that we're more aware of the possibility of abuse. But I think that there's a certain denial of the fact that any situation where you're going to be forming intense human relationships, including working together or learning together or something like that, that it's inevitable that in some cases these erotic feelings are going to occur. And simply telling people you're a pervert and an abuser if they ever occur to you is not a solution that has worked.
Or creepy. I love that.
Yes, exactly.
That word became, at some point in the 2000s, I feel like that word creepy became a way to describe like any behavior that was outside of a quote unquote normalcy. And I felt like it was really, especially hearing young people talk about creepy, about like, I don't know, just like a guy that is a bird watcher, goes and takes pictures of birds. Ooh, creepy. Like
what
all
is
of that.
Investment of these birds.
Yeah, what the fuck is that about? To be fair though, that is pretty creepy. But yeah, I felt like that there's like this bludgeon that's that maybe in a pop culture social media language that like, ends up just reducing a lot of complex phenomenon to just like bad or good in the box. But The Office seems like it's a really important show, in part because it's like literally modeling exactly what this is, this sort of idea that we don't know how to behave. And because we don't know how to behave, there's going to be a lot of humor there. Like we're going to laugh. In part, we're laughing because we understand we're all in these situations. I don't know how to behave. Like I feel like maybe COVID made this worse. I don't know about you, but like awkwardness in public, like when I can't talk to a Starbucks cashier anymore. Like the small talk, the like, what am I supposed to say here? What if I say something creepy? What if I say something that the person is like, ew? And I feel like more and more I probably will. And that's something that I think has not gone away. It's only gotten worse with COVID. We don't even have offices anymore to like be a part of that. And practice that awkwardness. It just makes it even worse to me. I mean, Zoom awkwardness is its own thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I feel like every time I do some type of Zoom event, I feel like I owe somebody an apology.
For what?
For just the fact that this is even happening. Like, this is so awkward. Or like, we've developed rituals for Zoom, like crosstalk, second crosstalk, then we somehow decide who was going to talk, and they say, well, okay, well, I was just going to say this. Like, this just seems like some like ritual exchanges have formed, or like waving at each other at the camera, even though that always feels so stupid.
I honestly
Um,
feel the same way about in-person classes in some ways now. It's been a while. I don't know about you. And I don't know how much teaching you do, but like the especially like a seminar style. I used to do these seminars at NYU where we would sit down with first year students, and they were these writing and research seminars, and we were talking about intense stuff that they had to do the reading for. And God, those were awkward. Those were awkward sit downs with like 12, 18 to 19-year-old students who have their own things going on, and definitely a lot of their own sort of political and social ideas. But then just like we have to perform this sort of like very specific exchange. And I felt like no one knew how to do it. Like no one knew how to do a platonic exchange anymore.
yeah, I mean that form of teaching has been the main form of teaching that I've been in. I'm in a great books program, and it's small discussion classes all the time. So I've gotten past the awkwardness of it
Oh,
after
good.
the first year, and often our students are seeking out that type of experience where it sounds like yours might have been kind of a gen ed situation where everybody has to do it.
Yeah, everyone
Um,
has to do it, but it's also just, I think, the first year of being at NYU is intimidating for students, and they were kind of
sure.
like, a lot of them were just deer in the headlights, you know. But I don't know. I thought of it in that way about the office and awkwardness too. Sort of like this template of kind of like how do we move through this and how do we behave, because it seems like
Yeah.
there's I don't know. There's a desire in a classroom to be like adventurous. I mean, I feel that way in this podcast too. There's a desire to like let's talk about the real stuff. Let's get to something really important rather than just sort of a surface discussion about the material. But at the same time, there's like these rules of how the discussion should go that
Mhm.
seem kind of rigid and formal. It seems like, and I mean that in a sort of like social atmosphere way, if that makes sense. I think a lot of people, especially young people, aren't sure what they're supposed to say or how they're supposed to talk about this material.
Yeah. Yeah. I think people are definitely like at my school, which is a majority white kind of suburban school. If you bring up race, definitely there's a clam up. Or like if you bring up anything related to sexuality,
Right.
there's a definite clam up. And like when I read that article by the poor college student who felt awkward in class, I'm like, that's just class. That's just doing class. Like we all feel awkward. And when I think about like the
You mean
strategy
the
I
editorial
use,
recently that was about the Marvel discussion that was happening in class and
oh yeah,
feminism?
about
Yeah.
whether Captain Marvel was feminist and she felt really shut down. And
Right, right.
I've been teaching those kind of classes for 12, 13 years now, and we usually have meetings with the students, like kind of halfway through, one-on-one meetings, just to check in with each individual student. Um, and I think like 90% of them say the rest of the class has this consensus or this great rapport, and I am the only one that's left out. But you can realize the math doesn't work out for 90% of them to be the only one that's left out, right?
Right,
That they
right.
all, I mean, there's this built in insecurity to a lot of situations. And really, the only way to get past it is to keep talking to each other and to approach each other as human beings. And like, if instead of just like assuming that somebody is like stony silence because you said the wrong thing, you could say, man, I noticed that you seem to react a certain way to what I said. Were you upset, or what was that about? And they're
Mm-hmm.
probably going to say, I just really had to pee and I was barely holding it together. And that's probably where that grimace came from. Or, like that, there's so many of those situations. Like somebody who's shy can appear to be arrogant or to think that they're too good for
Right.
everybody, when really inside they're like, oh man, I don't want to speak up or draw attention to myself because, oh, they're all going to hate me.
Mm-hmm.
Like we all know that our social performance can send the exact opposite intended message. And the only solution to that is to talk to each other more and be more honest, not to clam up.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
means living with awkwardness.
Yeah. Honestly, like thinking about all this stuff, honestly, I think reading social media and seeing, because people are able, they don't clam up on social media. They're able to say what they want to say on social media. And you end up seeing a lot of like really dark takes on everything, but also just I don't know. Part of my awkwardness in public is probably in part because I'm reading social media and thinking that people actually do notice these things and talk about them and share them online and say, I saw this guy doing this in Starbucks. It seems like there is a sense that that people are, everyone's gonna see, and everyone's gonna care, and that part of it amplifies that to me. I feel like The Office was maybe tapping into that early on, this notion.
Yeah, social media is really, it doesn't just obviously people are going to feel more comfortable typing something out semi-anonymously, not knowing who the audience is, and the platform produces kind of incentives for you to, if you say the crazier and crazier thing, you're going to get like more attention.
I did I think in my class once where we watched a film together, and I had my students tweeting about it live, and we had the Twitter feed like running next to the film, and we got so many more like cool comments. Like it was like the best class discussion we ever had, in part because students were competing in their sort of social media language, and they were all of a sudden they came alive and were sort of sharing takes on the film that I don't think would have necessarily shared verbally if we were just having a sort of a college style discussion. Stuff like that. I don't know. Stuff like that is it feels like the social media world and the world of the college class. The relationship between those two things is unclear to me. But it's one that I feel we have to talk about.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, I hear what you said, and I'm like, okay, I got to steal that. I want to do that too.
The other hand is like, don't do that.
Well, on the other hand, I mean, there's always this difficulty of, do we meet the students where they are, or do we challenge them to do what we as educators know is better? We know that students do not read with as much concentration or as much kind of endurance as they once may have, or like that as much as we did when we were students. Okay, so on the one hand, we need to acknowledge that we're not just going to dump like 50 pages of Hegel on them or something. I mean, obviously that always would have been a bad idea, but but on the other hand, I'm like, when I know, and I know that I'm going to sound like an elitist, I'm going to get canceled for this, but like reading books in a focused way is more intellectually rich and rewarding than scrolling through social media can ever be.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is simply a better learning technology, and discussions that are grounded in that kind of reading are always going to be better. And
canceled.
Frankly, if the students don't feel comfortable in the seminar room, that's a fixable problem that can be fixed by doing more time in the seminar room.
Right.
Like, if we believe in our pedagogy and we believe in what we actually know worked for us and got us hooked on learning, why would we just settle for showing them a YouTube video and having them like chat on Twitter and pretending that that's the same thing? Like, it's not. And yeah, so that's where I guess like I've had more experience kind of intentionally doing this type of pedagogy of like text-based discussions.
Mm-hmm.
In every class I teach, I try to turn into that, whether it's a gen ed class and the students resent it or not. And I've always had at least some success. And I've always had like some students who were like the standout students in that setting who come to one of my real seminar classes after that. Like I've had repeat students, even in very bad classes, who are like drawn to like, this is what it could be.
Yeah, there's a thirst for it. Yeah, I mean, the other part of me is like, their whole world is fucking Twitter and YouTube. What purpose does college serve if I'm just going to give them Twitter and YouTube? You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, I think that, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I feel like academics are often very hesitant to be proselytizers. As much as we have the reputation of being like people who are indoctrinating kids with Marxism, it feels like there's another end of that where a lot of professors and teachers just want to sort of like back away from the idea of like saying this is better at all. You know what I mean? Like, and sort of standing up for a practice.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think that there's something false about the stance that I'm going to hide my own personal views, and the students ideally shouldn't even know whether I'm a Democrat or a Republican or a Christian or an atheist. I'm like, first of all, they all know, or at least they've like formed an opinion. And so I tend to be pretty transparent when it's relevant about what my opinion is. And my opinion tends to be, far to the left of the mainstream in many issues. I have never known a student to change their opinion simply because they admire me and
Right.
want to have my, like, that's not how anybody does anything, right?
Yeah.
Like, why? I don't have that type of power over them. I can't even get them to do the reading. I can't even get them to read the syllabus, much less like change their worldview. So I think that but there's also this perception of danger. I think with a lot of the legislation that's going on right now with, trying to tightly regulate how things are talked about with regard to race in American history, there's this kind of fear that if students were to change their worldview or break with what their parents gave them in school, that this would be a kind of violation of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I just don't think that that's realistic. I think that that's part of the purpose of school, is to give students a chance to break with mom and dad, or if they choose not to have at least known that they chose it on purpose, and this fantasy that we can somehow educate them, maybe just in job related things or just in like skills or politically neutral things, so that their beliefs, their precious beliefs, are not challenged in any way. That's going to lead to the stupidest and most boring and pointless school possible. Like, let's just replace it with YouTube videos and get it over with,
Well, yeah. I mean, I teach American history, which is barely taught at all in a lot of colleges anymore. But for a long time, I feel like in the discipline, at least when I was going to graduate school and beyond, people were thinking a lot about, well, we need to convert the discipline into sort of a jobs training sort of discipline in which we can sort of sell history as a methodology that is transferable to all sorts of corporate jobs and, research positions and all sorts of things like that. And it made me think a lot about, because I know you've written about this with awkwardness. It's sort of like, where does this come from? But it seems like the long arc of the '60s and like college, the college changing in a lot of ways in the '60s. And one of those things was, I mean, there were good and bad things about it. One of them is like the democratization of higher education and the expansion of higher education's access to higher education from groups that were completely left out of that experience before. And I feel like that's part of why there's such a right-wing sort of hatred of college in now. That might have partly to do with it. But I wonder what you have what that has to do with the awkwardness thing. Because I think part of what you were describing in that book is this idea that the way to be breaks down, and the kind of like what the purpose of all these things are breaks down, and hadn't been really replaced by anything. And I feel like in college, there was, with the New Left sort of challenge to what college was and what it could be and how it could fit into capitalism and how it could play a role in, an anti-war movement and all that sort of thing. None of those questions were answered. Like, it sort of like was this flame out with the New Left. But it seems like that we're sort of dealing with that question of what purpose college serves in 2022. Right. Yeah.
Like, it used to be to give you a certain amount of cultural capital, and everybody agreed, reading Shakespeare and Dickens,
right,
and Homer and all of this, like, that you were going to appear to be smart if you knew about this stuff, and that's valuable too. And I think that it also served a cultural purpose of having common points of reference. I think having that type of cultural tradition that everybody knows about, more than just comic books, which seems to be all we have now, that's valuable in itself. And it seems like the existing canon came in for a challenge, beginning in the 60s and 70s, and I think there was an opportunity then to create a more diverse and inclusive and truly global canon, especially in literature. Like, it's not that hard to kind of come up with these connections among literature and philosophy and all this in religion and stuff like that. Like that, we could have had a more broad-based and kind of increasingly so, like an increasingly diversifying canon. But instead of doing that, it seems like people didn't want to have the fights that it would take to do that, or they didn't want to, like I've had curriculum discussions with some of my older colleagues who are now retired, and like, how can we diversify with more African American literature? Like, how would we even know what to do? Like, as though it's just unknowable. I'm like,
right.
There's whole scholarly disciplines. Let's just ask them.
Yeah.
Like, what is the biggest deal in your field? What's the most representative thing? Is there anything that connects with the Odyssey? Like, just talk to people. Like, there's this fear of talking to people, I think, that is pervasive in American culture about anything important. And in the absence of coming up with some type of alternate approach that would kind of reflect the newly emerging values, there was just this total abdication. And the only thing that exists to fill in the gap is the job training bullshit. And it seems like that's been the default answer. And now I think that at a lot of schools, it's not fixable. Like, I think, like I teach at a liberal arts institution, and like, it seems clear to me that attempting to build a gen ed core curriculum that would have like specific texts that we all read, like the Odyssey or Their Eyes Were Watching God or the Mahabharata or whatever you want, that everybody is so traumatized in advance by the idea that we'd have to talk to each other and hash it out that it's simply impossible. It's simply all we can do is make a smorgasbord distribution requirement. And that's the most that we can do. And also the perception that students will always resent anything that's required, as though there's no different way of teaching it, or there's no way of like winning them over in the classroom. That kind of fatalism seems bad too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a weird moment in higher ed. We've been having discussions about it over the course of COVID, in part because we're wondering, like, what does this do? How does this change how people perceive the usefulness of college? I don't know. After 2 years of Zooming and then kind of like awkwardly getting back in person, I don't know. I still feel like it could go either way, especially when you look at like how the economy may go in the United States. That does drive when the economy goes to shit. It does drive people into community colleges and does drive people into like high. I don't want to say I hesitate to say hiding out in the academy, but going to those institutions more so when there aren't jobs. But again, it's sort of like, what are they pursuing when they're going to college? Because it seems like there's a perception that college is very expensive and that it would be like a luxury to go to a 4-year public research school and pay, $30,000 a year for the life of the mind when you're not going to get a job at the end of that. That seems like a pretty pervasive feeling in the culture. And I don't know. Part of me is like, if college doesn't change in some way, especially it's like sort of like perception and its costs, then its relevance does sort of seem in question, doesn't it? Is that a cynical view?
No, I think that the funding model is an absolute disaster, but intentionally so. I mean, Ronald Reagan got his political start trying to break the University of California, and it was under Reagan that student loans started to become the norm for funding college. And so, I mean, that's an intentional policy choice to make college more economically minded, or to make students think more about the costs and make them shoulder the costs, to actively discourage the life of the mind.
I work at a school, Cal State University, Channel Islands, which used to be a state mental institution, and it was shut down by Reagan in the 80s. And now it's a school where, a lot of working class students end up, coming there, transferring from local community colleges. And they're shouldering huge debt. And so I'm sitting there like thinking about, you just saying that Reagan was instrumental in sort of, moving things towards student loans. The campus that I'm on is literally an old state mental institution that was closed by Reagan, now filled with students that are paying student loans, partly because of Reagan and other conservatives moving the country that way. It's pretty grim, dude. Like, that's a pretty grim view, honestly, because as a mental institution, it was. We're dealing with homelessness in our town, right? Mentally ill people who have nowhere to go. So, like, all the side effects of those decisions in the 80s are like so present right now.
Yeah. Yeah, the side effects are not just side effects, so they're intended effects. I think the fact that mass homelessness resulted from neoliberal policy is a feature, not a bug, because it provides this constant visual reminder. This could be you.
Yeah.
Your value is not guaranteed. You could be one of these worthless people on the street.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, honestly, in terms of, living near Los Angeles, and in our town itself, the homelessness situation is out of control. But the idea of, like, quote unquote, doing anything about it, it seems like it doesn't hurt the bottom line of anybody that's profiting off of it. In other words, like the elite model of neoliberalism that you're describing that can sort of like take masses of homeless people on the street seems like, yeah, it's not going to be impacted at all. Like, in fact, like, they can just use the cops to move them to another neighborhood when people get mad, and that's that. It seems like there is no solution because there is no solution.
Right. Yeah, the only solution is violence. And yeah, the logical endpoint of homelessness policy is that the homeless should simply die.
Which is what happens.
Yeah. But I think, thankfully, the state is not, investing resources and making that actively happen. But I worry that there would be some support for it if they did.
Well, this dude that was shooting homeless people in New York City and Washington, D.C. the last couple days, whatever that is, and it sounds like it's a result of mental illness, but like it's so fucking weird seeing like Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, who is for the last like several weeks since he's taken over has been like demonizing homeless people because there have been a couple of violent incidents between the homeless population and the non-homeless population. We'll put it that way in New York City. But there's been this association of homelessness with violence coming from the mayor, coming from people in New York, officials in New York, and then a guy shoots homeless people. And all of those officials act like, oh my God, this is the most horrible thing. These are citizens of our city. This violence is terrible. And sort of like, well, you fucking create this violence, and you've demonized homeless people in the press for the last several weeks. To me, it's part of why I wanted to talk to you, because there are sort of like truths underlying a lot of the way we talk about this stuff that I don't know. They come out it's weird to say this, but they come out in TV shows. They come out in movies that you can sort of see the assumptions. I wonder, it's sort of like towards the end here, if we could just say a little bit about your like kind of theoretical approach, because part of what you're doing, it seems like, with your work is intervening on that in one way or another, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm very, demonization has become one of the main kind of concepts of my academic work that's not about pop culture. And by that, I don't mean simply talking in harshly negative terms about somebody, I mean specifically setting them up to fail and then blaming them for their failure. Like putting them in a situation where, like their back's against the wall, they're going to react in a certain way. Like an example, I think, would be in a lot of police shootings, the police officer is escalating and demanding this kind of impossible obedience to justify what they're about to do to the person. Like I read a column I didn't read a column. I saw a screenshot from a column by Rod Dreher, the kind of weird conservative Christian commentator, who was saying if George Floyd had simply stopped resisting, none of this ever would have happened. And no, you physically cannot stop resisting a chokehold. That's evolution, and for good reason, because if you stop resisting it, it would kill you. And I mean, that's the most kind of extreme and absurd instance of this. But yeah, I think it's surprising that there isn't more violence from homeless people because of how much society has rejected them. Why should they obey society's rules if society throws them in the garbage? Why should they feel bound by anybody when everybody treats them like dirt? The restraint.
If I'm being honest, this is part of the reason why I am nervous around homeless populations, because I can very easily imagine myself in that situation and how I would feel about it, and that I would have like an anger about being in that situation that would be hard to control, especially as amplified by all the experiences of actually having that, of actually being in that situation, if that makes sense. To me, I'm right with you. I don't know why there's not more violence, honestly.
Yeah, and there isn't. I walk through a homeless encampment every day to get to the train station.
Mm-hmm.
Like, living in Chicago, I've been around a lot of homeless people, and I've never had any harm or potential harm come to me. Other awkward encounters certainly, or like somebody who appears to be crazy, and you're just like, I hope that if I walk away, they don't follow me, and they don't follow you. And that could be simply luck on my part, I'll admit. And there's a certain privilege of being, a white male of
Sure.
a certain age.
Mm-hmm.
They know they're calculating if they were to mess with me, it's more likely the police would get involved or something like that. But yeah, that there still is a kind of social code, and there still is a kind of basic respect. And I think that in the encampment that I walk through, like I can see out my window the bridge that it's under. I'm pretty sure they just want to be left alone,
Mm-hmm.
And they want the cops not to come clean out their encampment, which mercifully they have not done all winter, because that would have been disastrous and people would have literally died from it. So I'm glad that the cops have shown rare restraint and not just subjecting people to death arbitrarily. But I think that the idea that the social contract is broken, we see it all around us. Like, we're the wealthiest country in the world, and the fact that there are even anybody is going without a home involuntarily is just an absolute obscenity. And yet it's every day. It's our everyday experience. I remember my mom was visiting from the suburbs, like in our small town, there are no homeless people. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she asked me at one point, like, how do you deal with the emotional load of being around homeless people so much? And my first thought was, we've been around homeless people?
Yeah.
So like I had just like
right.
not even noticed as it like faded into the background. And like that's super corrosive. And that's what society is doing to all of us.
I've talked about that with New York City, because I was raised in a pretty comfortable suburb in Southern California, but I moved to New York City and spent all my 20s and 30s there, and going to grad school, etc. And when I first got to New York, I was a wide-eyed, idealistic Southern California kid who was like, if you see a homeless person, you should go talk to them and help them, and that sort of thing. And I was really like very hippie-minded when it came to that. And that slowly over the course of months and years just got completely washed out of me, to the point where I became like every other New Yorker, a sort of like cynical person who did exactly like what you're saying. Don't even notice that you're stepping over starving people as you're getting on the train, etc. And there's that always bothered me. And I always kind of mourned and lamented the like death of my hippie soul. But the other part of me was like, well, you can't fucking be that way. That's just the way the world is. And it's like that process through which it's normalized, through which it's sort of like these people are separate, they don't matter, they're to be stepped over, etc. It happens in everyone one way or another. And it's something, it's something that to me is part of what you're getting at, which is like we all sort of like live a weird lie in some ways, or we act in a way that we wouldn't want people to know exactly how we feel inside. I know I wanted to bring this up with you, so I'll throw it out here because we're almost done. Louis C.K. There's a character that seems like he kind of embodies a lot of what you're talking about, including the cancel stuff and everything else. But I thought one of the things I think is interesting about the whole Louis C.K. saga is that before he got canceled for sexual impropriety and all all that stuff that came out. Before he did, like, he was just embraced by like NPR and the New York Times, Atlantic, like Salon. Everyone was right. The whole liberal elite establishment was writing about this guy and being like, he is the ultimate truth teller of our world because he says the things we don't say in public. He says the things that we really feel, like when we go on a date with a woman, we actually want to rape them, or if the sorts of things like that. Like they got at like they used Louis as a way to say like, this is the truth. This guy says the truth. But then as soon as he got canceled for being like a real douchebag, no one says that anymore. Like, it's just gone. That whole thing is gone. No one wants to talk about that. NPR wanted to celebrate Louis as our ultimate truth teller for saying the ugliness that was underneath us. I don't know what to do with any of that, but it seems like it kind of corresponds to a lot of the things that you're sort of touching on in your work.
Yeah. And I think that like Louis, like the last season of the Louis TV show, where he's having this like, where finally Pamela like agrees to date him, but he like seems to almost resent her for it. Like there's a lot that's true about those type of like about masculinity and about the kind of woundedness that comes in those types of situations.
Totally.
But it's like, it's so hard to watch and so creepy and so kind of self-indulgent too, that I was just like, how can anybody stand to be watching this? Like there's a case where he sexually assaults her and like forces her to kiss him before she'll leave. And then like they get together anyway. Like, and I like in a way, I was commenting on that. I was watching that season while I was writing creepiness, and I'm just like, thank you, Lord, that this has come into my life at the perfect time. But and I mean, in the TV write-up culture, there was such a desire or willingness to like, Louis is smart. He's not really doing what it seems like. He'll get his comeuppance. I mean, this is all going to come together. I trust him. And then it didn't. And it's like, and then, a year later, it turns out that he'd been doing things that sound like very much like stuff that you've been talking about on the show,
Yeah.
It's a very disturbing phenomenon because there are still Louis C.K. bits that I think about and want to quote. Like he has the one on homelessness where like his cousin from the Boondocks or something comes and sees a homeless man and like, oh my God, does he need help? And he's like, oh yeah, he totally desperately needs help, but yeah, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Like there are so many good bits.
That's part of me is uncomfortable about that too, and and that's what's interesting because I thought NPR and all those different like liberal outlets were kind of gassing him up and saying how brilliant he was, but part of me agreed with it. Part of me was like, well, it's brilliant because he really is like saying things that all of us feel, but none of us feel comfortable saying, and there's something important about that. Whereas now, we saw the kind of like, I don't know. I think it's an important incident, the whole Louis thing, because it reveals part of what you're talking about. It's sort of like capital T truth that's like, may or may not exist, but seems like it's sort of filtered through our expectations of what we're supposed to say, the kinds of things we're supposed to believe, etc. And it means that there's like, I don't know. There's like, you call it neoliberalism. There's sort of like this story we tell that's total bullshit, and we all know it's bullshit. And that's part of why politics is the way it is right now. It's sort of like we're all operating on different channels of bullshit. I don't know. That's one way I would see it.
Right. Or like we reward him for transgressing norms, but not like that. We reward you for being this type of person, but until we suddenly don't. Like that. I think that's part of the fear of cancel culture and part of the fear of like political correctness or what's now known as wokeness is that the standards can change and turn on a dime. Without you didn't get the memo or something like that, and suddenly you're behind on the terminology or whatever. And those fears are exaggerated, but they do speak to something real about those phenomena. It's like I think that what is called political correctness or wokeness is like kind of an attempt to create a moral code that would replace the traditional moral code, but it has no legitimacy in people's eyes. It has, because it's so obviously new and it's so constantly ever changing. The intentions behind it are mostly good, but the execution is like just guaranteed to fail.
Yeah, who would create that new social model? And it seems like, I mean, the New York Times just had this stupid editorial about cancel culture and free speech this morning. That's the correlation that they're making. Is like free speech. The words free speech become sort of associated with something that is more of a social process that you're describing. And so, like, it gets, in other words, like, I don't know if you would agree with this, but it seems like free speech is sort of being confused with what we call cancel culture. They're kind of two different things. When I think of free speech, I mean, I'm thinking about like state censorship, not necessarily like a bunch of people giving you the stink eye because you said something shitty in class.
Right. Or like, there's not going to be a season 5 of Louis because everybody thinks he's a creepy guy now. Like,
it's not state censorship.
No, and I mean, that's unfortunate for him, I suppose. Like, but I mean, that's why God created like selling insurance or something. It's not as though he's gonna die on the street. Yeah, like it's as though everybody who has a certain level of privilege or notoriety is entitled to always keep it. And that, like, on the one hand, we want to pretend to be a meritocracy, but on the other hand, it's like you get like celebrity or movie star tenure so that you can say whatever you want or do whatever you want. And like those things can't both be true. You know, like if Louis is capitalizing on the fact that he seems to be a real stand-up guy who's like really sensitive to the issues, like forcing women to stay in your hotel room while you're masturbating in front of them, he probably should have known that that was not compatible with continuing to have this reputation.
I think he deeply did, and why he lied about it for so long.
Right.
I mean, what's funny is Louis is obviously a really smart guy. He knew the audience he was playing. I mean, he's a smart capitalist. He sells, and he in part, I think, knew the audience that he was playing to. You know, he was playing to a sort of that like liberal, college educated audience. It seems like he wasn't Carrot Top, you know, he wasn't doing, you know, stupid shit in Vegas just to collect money. He was sort of like, I don't know. I think he's an arrogant person, clearly, who thought of himself as a philosopher, but was also knew his audience and knew that he was aiming at people who would kind of be riding that line. That's in part of why it was funny for them, if it made sense, because he was able to ride that line of propriety that maybe wouldn't work in other audiences who didn't give a fuck about those things.
Yeah, that's true. That you need the kind of liberal sensitivity to transgress against.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I think that there's so much in our culture that's based on like that transgression is the cool thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, like, oh wait, not that far.
Right. It's a moment for liberalism and what we might call neoliberalism in the culture. I think for exactly those reasons. I don't know if it's funny because I was thinking about your work and thinking about the stuff you've written about sociopaths and stuff you've written about creepiness and awkwardness. A part of me wonders, like, are all of those things operative in the same way as they were in 2005, in 2012, or are they changing? Because it seems like I don't know. It's so early with the Ukraine thing, but it seems like Ukraine is coming like a hammer to sort of like bring back a lot of sort of liberal ideas. I mean, all of my neighborhood, dude, is a neighborhood that's filled with those signs that say, "In this house we believe," right? So like and like all of those signs have been replaced by like Ukraine flags this week. And like that's been really interesting to me as a sort of like the liberal virtue signal of like, here's what I am and here's what I believe. Sort of can shift. And that iconography has now shifted away from it, the sort of like, we believe in that water is a right or whatever it says, to Ukraine as being the symbol of like, we believe in truth and justice and the American way, sort of thing.
Right. They didn't say water is a right. They said water is life.
That's right. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Water is life.
Saying it's a right would like mean that you have to like make some effort to provide it.
That's a good point.
But yeah, I think that in the pivot for that, I think was the Russian election interference, which to me appears to have been real. It appears to have had a relatively marginal effect.
Mm-hmm.
And it was relentlessly talked up and demonized in the old-fashioned sense. in like kind of slightly left of center media, almost as though the problem with Trump is that he's associated with Russia,
Right.
and kind of like this weird kind of liberal militarism that seems to have like no actual electoral base or no electoral, like that this desire to like kind of get back to the Cold War, as if that's the only like comprehensible framework for world politics. Like even the fact that they're saying the Cold War has started up again with the Ukraine conflict is absolutely absurd. The whole point of a Cold War is that you're not shooting.
Right.
Like this is a regular war. It's not the Cold War.
Well, what about the people who are like, this is World War II, or, you know, this is World War III, or Putin is Hitler, or who are the Nazis so that I can know who's good and bad? It seems like part of what you're describing, we talk about a lot on this show, the history of the 20th century and the 1960s and 70s being a sort of breakdown of like what things mean. And a sort of, I mean, I guess you could throw postmodernism in there as a like sort of broad category. But what I mean is sort of like there's when I hear the sort of liberal desire to go back to the Cold War, or this is World War II, or that's a Nazi and that's Hitler, it seems like a desire to like make things make sense again and make things like fall into simple categories in which I don't have to sort of live in this awkwardness of nothing having clarity to it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, I think the fact that the Ukraine war is one in which the U.S. is not a primary aggressor or not even primarily at fault.
Awkward.
It's occurring. It's like, it is awkward. It's awkward to know how to talk about it because like I worry about how to talk about it online because I don't want to come across as like pro-American or something like that.
Yeah. Or like in some stupid camp, you know, like one way or the other. Well, Adam, this was really fun talking with you. I really appreciate it. I've been enjoying your tweets and I've been enjoying your work and thinking about talking with you. This was fun. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Well, okay. I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Adam Kotsko. Super fun talking with him. Go check out his work. Let us know what you think. Go follow him on Twitter. Super funny guy on Twitter. And go check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. We really appreciate it. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks so much for listening to the program. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.